and the other one was cardiovascular. But Mr. Willis, for the eighth defendant, my learned friend, dealt extensively with a number of the other ones. Quite frankly, my lord, Mr. Bakaba accuses the witness of not providing credible scientific evidence, asks him to provide it, elects himself not to go through it. But my lord, the fact of the matter is these conditions were dealt with extensively, and he's provided the documentation. I might also point out, my lord, that what I'm reading from here is duplicated, my lord, in the first to seventh defendants trial bundle. They put up this entire publication, my lord, after cross-examination, examination in chief with this witness had closed.
Yes.
My Lord,
allow it.
My Lord, might I weigh in on the argument? I have elected, unlike Mr. Bakaba, to sit back and at some stage to place the following on record. I'm going to use this opportunity, if you would allow me, my Lord. My learned friend's re-examination is not, we're not in agreement with all of his re-examination. But much like one treats repeated use of hearsay evidence, one places sometimes the objection on record once, just to make your Lord alive to the fact that we're not objecting, but we'll leave it for argument later. That's the position I would like to take. But my Lord, my learned friend's not entirely correct in what he's just submitted to your Lordship. When Mr. Bakaba challenged the professor on where is this credible scientific evidence, which are words that come out of his own summary, he wasn't challenging him to give him an opportunity simply to provide an opportunity for his counsel to come back and reply. This reply is used for clarification. Where there are disputed areas, it's there to be of assistance to your Lordship. It is open to Mr. Bakaba to decide whether he wants to use that documentation to cross-examine the witness with or not. Just because Mr. Bakaba doesn't raise it, or because I later cross-examine the witness on issues that might arise in that document, does not suffice for our learned friend to cross-examine or re-examine out of the document. That's not the test, my Lord. The first test is whether or not there are areas of confusion where the witness deserves an opportunity to remedy the confusion that may have arisen. But, my Lord, what this does is may give rise to a need for us to seek leave to cross-examine again, my Lord. That's the difficulty ultimately.
Mr.
My Lord, the fact of the matter is that the question of whether or not there was credible evidence to support the conclusion that cannabis is can effectively be used to treat or prevent chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting was pertinently dealt with under cross-examination. I'm entitled to deal with that in reply.
Yes, I'll allow it.
Thank you. So page 263.14, prisoner, under the heading chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting.
Sorry, 263 point?
Point 14.
You dealt with this?
Yes, thank you, Lord. I in fact dealt with that. And I was coming...
you were at 17.
Yes, to 263.17, where the conclusion of this chapter is there is conclusive evidence that oral cannabinoids are effective antiemetics in the treatment of chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Could you explain could you translate this for us, Professor Nutt, into layman's terms?
Well, this tells us that these experts believe that oral cannabinoids can help reduce both the sense of nausea and I think also the vomiting that occurs when people are treated with cancer by chemotherapy. It stops them feeling so nauseous and it reduces the vomiting. So this is evidence of an ability of cannabis products to treat this disorder. All these symptoms.
Right. you'll recall, in regard to the question of HIV and AIDS,
Yes.
that Mr. Bukabe, SC, my learned friend for the state, suggested to you that you were making a reckless statement because you were saying that cannabis can cure AIDS. Clarify, is that what you were saying?
No, of course not. That would be a preposterous statement.
What were you saying?
What I was saying was that cannabis or cannabis products may have utility in dealing with some of the symptoms of AIDS and some of the symptoms of the treatment of AIDS, such as pain, such as nausea, such as wasting.
Can I ask you to turn to page 263.18? Under the heading Anorexia and Weight Loss. The question is posed, are cannabis or cannabinoids an effective treatment for anorexia and weight loss associated with HIV/AIDS, cancer-associated anorexia, cachexia syndrome, and anorexia nervosa? The last sentence on that page, under the heading AIDS wasting syndrome, the review authors concluded that there was some evidence suggesting that cannabinoids were effective in weight gain in HIV.
Correct.
On page 263.21, under the heading Discussion of Findings, says there is some evidence for oral cannabinoids being able to increase weight in patients with the HIV-associated wasting syndrome and anorexia nervosa. Could you tell us what is HIV-associated wasting syndrome and what is anorexia nervosa?
HIV-associated wasting syndrome is, and anorexia nervosa, they're conditions where people lose weight. In anorexia nervosa, there is an intention to lose weight. People voluntarily restrict their food intake. In age wasting syndrome, it's less understood what's happening, but it's a state, probably a combination of peripheral and central effects of the AIDS virus to reduce appetite and also to dampen down the body's ability to maintain muscle mass.
Goes on to say no benefit has been demonstrated in cancer-associated anorexia cachexia syndrome. The studies have generally been small and of short duration and may not have investigated the optimal dose of the cannabinoid. In one study in HIV patients, both dronabinol and inhaled cannabis increased weight significantly compared to the placebo dronabinol. Cannabis has long been felt to have an orexigenic effect, increasing food intake. Can you explain that?
Well, that's called the munchies. I mean, people who smoke cannabis very commonly describe that they get hungry. And so that's what's called an orexigenic effect. Orexigenic means driving appetite.
In the conclusion, 4-4A, there is limited evidence that cannabis and oral cannabinoids are effective in increasing appetite and decreasing weight loss associated with HIV/AIDS.
Correct.
Then if I could ask you to turn to page 263.22 over the page.
I am there.
This is a case report entitled Cannabis Improves Symptoms of ADHD. Explain to us, what is ADHD?
ADHD is a brain syndrome. It stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And people who suffer from it have characteristic problems with impulse control, with attentional control. They can't focus, their eyes are always over the place. And sometimes they're hyperactive. Sometimes they especially in young children, they run around rather than sitting still in the class.
In this document, in the abstract, it reads, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, is characterized by attention deficits and an altered activation level. The purpose of this case investigation was to highlight that people with ADHD can benefit in some cases from the consumption of THC. A 28-year-old male who showed improper behavior and appeared to be very maladjusted and inattentive while sober appeared to be completely inconspicuous while having a very high blood plasma level of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. Performance tests, which were conducted with the test batteries ART 2020 and TAP, provided sufficient and partly over-average results in driving-related performance. Thus, it has to be considered that in the case of ADHD, THC can have atypical effects and can even lead to an enhanced driving-related performance.
That is correct.
The conclusion is at page 263.24. Just read the first sentence under the heading Conclusion. The present case report suggests that individuals suffering from ADHD, a dysfunction with a symptomatic change in activity levels, may in some cases benefit from cannabis treatment in that it appears to regulate activation to a level which may be considered optimum for performance. Just explain that to us, please.
So typically, people with ADHD are poor drivers. They don't pay attention to the car in front or the cars beside. They're thinking of other things. In fact, in some countries, if you have a diagnosis of ADHD, you are not allowed to drive unless you have treatment. And there are established treatments for ADHD. Those are amphetamines and Ritalin, methylphenidate. And what this is showing is that in this particular person, cannabis had a beneficial effect, which actually these, I think, did not previously show. So this is a very interesting observation. But it's interesting not because of this case, but because it accords with a considerable amount of what you might call teacher-related insights from America. There's a group in America of teachers who believe that cannabis is a better treatment for their children in their class with ADHD than stimulants like Ritalin. And there's a whole organisation trying to encourage research into the value of cannabis for the treatment of ADHD. And in fact, colleagues of mine in London have just conducted a trial specifically of this question. We're waiting the final results.
And if I could turn you to 263.38. This is Biomed Central Harm Reduction Journal, entitled Cannabis as a Substitute for Alcohol and Other Drugs. The abstract reads, substitution can be operationalized as the conscious choice to use one drug, legal or illicit, instead of or in conjunction with another, due to issues such as perceived safety, level of addiction potential, effectiveness in relieving symptoms, access and level of acceptance. This practice of substitution has been observed among individuals using cannabis for medical purposes. This study examined drug and alcohol use and the occurrence of substitution among medical cannabis patients. The conclusion at the bottom of that page reads, the substitution of one psychoactive substance for another with the goal of reducing negative outcomes can be included within the framework of harm reduction. Medical cannabis patients have been engaging in substitution by using cannabis as an alternative to alcohol, prescription, and illicit drugs. Explain that these findings to us, please.
So this is a survey of how people use medical cannabis to assist them with problems with other drugs. And if you go to the results section, you see that they if you go to the bottom of the results paragraph, 40% use cannabis as a substitute for alcohol, 26% as a substitute for illicit drugs, and 66% as a substitute for prescription drugs. And the reasons they did it are illustrated in the next sentence. The most common reasons given for substituting were less adverse side effects, better symptom management, less withdrawal potential with cannabis. So here you have people who are in a sense self-medicating. I imagine I'm not sure, it's not clear whether they're getting these prescribed for those indications, but they are using medical marijuana to try to deal with what they see as greater problems, such as alcohol dependence and prescription drug use. And this is a very, very well-established principle right across the whole range of treatments for people who use drugs. It's always preferable to use a less harmful drug. And most countries, I believe even South Africa, have policies in place to try to administer less harmful drugs to people who are using more harmful drugs to get them off. And, examples of that would be methadone and buprenorphine for opiates.
The conclusion is at page 263.41. It reads, the substitution of one psychoactive substance for another with the goal of reducing negative outcomes can be included within the framework of harm reduction. Medical cannabis patients have been engaging in substitution by using cannabis as an alternative to alcohol, prescription, and illicit drugs. This brings up two important points. First, self-determination, the right of an individual to decide which treatment or substance is most effective and least harmful for them. If an individual finds less harm in cannabis than in the drug prescribed by their doctor, do they have a right to choose? Secondly, the recognition that substitution might be a viable alternative to abstinence for those who are not able or do not wish to stop using psychoactive substances completely. What is your take on that?
Well, I think this is an example of what we're seeing more and more, that patients are becoming empowered to make decisions about their own lives. And it's been very difficult for patients up till now to be able to do that. But because cannabis is relatively easy to get in countries like the USA, people are experimenting with it and discovering it is useful. And of course, one might say, well, that was known 100 years ago, but deliberately obscured by international policies. So this is one of the reasons I am very much in favour of medical marijuana and very much against the idea that you do nothing until some drug company somewhere in the world has spent $1 billion showing that some components of cannabis work, because that, as I said, won't happen. And people are doing it now, and it's important we collate that data to advise doctors and other patients.
Then, if I could ask you to turn to 263.45.
Yes.
This is a concise report, Rheumatology, Advanced Access publication of 9 November 2005, preliminary assessment of the efficacy, tolerability, and safety of a cannabis-based medicine, Sativex, in the treatment of pain caused by rheumatoid arthritis. The objectives: to assess the efficacy of a cannabis-based medicine, CBM, in the treatment of pain due to rheumatoid arthritis. The conclusion: in the first ever controlled trial of a CBM in RA, rheumatoid arthritis, a significant analgesic effect was observed and disease activity was significantly suppressed following Sativex treatment. Whilst the differences are small and variable across the population, they represent benefits of clinical relevance and show the need for more detailed investigation in this indication. Explain that.
So rheumatoid arthritis is an arthritis which is caused when the body attacks itself, the immune system in the body attacks the joints. and it's associated with inflammation of the joints, pain in the joints. The pain is often very disruptive to sleep, and in the morning they often have considerable degree of stiffness. It's typically treated by what we call non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, drugs like ibuprofen, sometimes with drugs like steroids, which are potentially quite harmful, and many patients continue to have problems. I myself have done studies on the sleep disruption of people with rheumatoid arthritis. It's very profound. They wake up considerably more than the normal population. So what this shows is that this is Sativex. This is this mixture of THC and cannabidiol that we've talked about previously. And it shows it does have some value in reducing pain when they walk, pain at rest, improving sleep quality.
I presume there was no pun intended when you said it attacks the joints.
There was definitely no pun intended. I'm too tired to be humorous.
If I could take you back to 263.43.
Yes.
It's entitled Cannabinoids Remove Plaque-Forming Alzheimer's Proteins from Brain Cells.
Yes.
Take us through this, please.
Well, we all know that Alzheimer's disease is becoming one of the serious challenges certainly to Western society. And the incidence is growing as the population gets older. We're not entirely sure what causes Alzheimer's disease, and at present we don't have any treatment to prevent it. We have treatments that can help people with the memory loss and to some extent help them with the behavioral disturbance, but we can't stop the disease. One of the theories is that the disease is due to the deposition in the brain of a particular protein called amyloid. And amyloid is a normal, it's like a lubricant for the brain, but it's quite a long molecule, and in Alzheimer's it seems to stick together, and then those clumps become bigger and bigger, and they're called plaques. So if you look at the brain of someone with Alzheimer's, you have a lot of these plaques. And it's believed that the plaques themselves contribute in part to the disorder because they become inflamed and then the nerves around the plaques die. So there's a huge interest in trying to find treatments to stop the plaques forming and growing. And this is just an interesting observation that maybe cannabis-based products could stop plaques being formed.
Page 263.48. At the bottom.
Just before you continue, you said it stops, may stop plaque forming. But this article speaks about remove plaque forming proteins from brain cells.
Well, yes, that's correct. So it would be that you... Currently, it's very difficult to diagnose Alzheimer's before the plaques are there. I mean, in an ideal world...
No, just the question that you said it
yes. So,
prevents, whereas this is speaking about removing.
Well, yes. So the current approaches to Alzheimer's are trying to suck out the plaques.
Yes.
And I think the supposition is that if you could have a treatment that kind of sucked them out the minute they were formed, that would be potentially preventative, because the problem is once they've been we can suck them out once they've been, but by that time, by the time we've diagnosed that, people are often demented. But so the idea is that you might be able to suck them out very early so that you don't get the damage from the plaques.
Page 263.48. At the bottom there's a heading, anxiety. Anxiety disorders share features of excessive fear and anxiety, which induce psychological and physical symptoms that can cause significant distress or interfere with social, occupational, and other areas of functioning. Over the page, the question is posed, are cannabis or cannabinoids an effective treatment for the improvement of anxiety symptoms? Deals with the reviews, the primary literature, the discussion of the findings. And then we have the conclusion at page 263.50. And the conclusion is there is limited evidence that cannabidiol is an effective treatment for the improvement of anxiety symptoms as assessed by a public speaking test in individuals with social anxiety disorders.
Correct.
Explain that to us, please.
So, anxiety, we all know what anxiety is, but for some people, anxiety can turn into a disorder, and social anxiety disorder is a disorder, a very common disorder, particularly in men, where they become very anxious speaking in public, or they become anxious speaking to members of the opposite sex or the same sex if they're that way oriented. And that anxiety is very damaging. It can lead, well, it does. It actually, social anxiety is second only to schizophrenia in reducing the work achievements, the lifetime achievements of people with mental illness. So it can be a very profoundly disabling disorder, because if you can't speak to other people because you blush, you stutter, you choke, you feel faint, then you really have a struggle in life. And many of them turn to alcohol or to stimulants because they find that that can help them. So it's a very disabling disorder. It has a high suicide rate, nearly as high as, the highest suicide rate of any depression, any form of anxiety. Not as high as depression, but significantly high. And many people fail treatments. I have treated hundreds of people with social anxiety disorder over the years, and many of them don't respond even though you're using 3 or 4 different additive treatments. So this particular study was a study that was mimicking social interaction by making people perform a speaking task with or on or off cannabidiol, and it showed, and this was one of the very first studies, it showed that cannabidiol could have an anxiety relieving effect.
Page 263.51. It's a study dealing with Crohn's disease. Can you explain to us what Crohn's disease is?
So Crohn's disease is a disease, it's like rheumatoid arthritis of the bowel. It's a disease where the body's immune system attacks its own bowels. It's associated with enormous pain, episodes of severe diarrhea, loss of weight, and in some cases it can be terminal.
Page 263.51. Study is entitled Cannabis Induces a Clinical Response in Patients with Crohn's Disease, a prospective placebo-controlled study. Next to background and aims, it says the marijuana plant Cannabis sativa has been reported to produce beneficial effects for patients with inflammatory bowel diseases, but this has not been investigated in controlled trials. We performed a prospective trial to determine whether cannabis can induce remission in patients with Crohn's disease. It's a description of the methods and the results. And then under the conclusions it says, although the primary endpoint of the study, induction of remission, was not achieved, a short course, 8 weeks, of THC-rich cannabis produced significant clinical steroid-free benefits to 10 of 11 patients with active Crohn's disease compared with placebo without side effects. Further studies with larger patient groups and a non-smoking mode of intake are warranted. clinicaltrials.gov.
So this is very important, because we know from conversations with people who self-medicate with marijuana, people with Crohn's disease are the ones who often report the greatest, well, they report significant benefit, but they're forced to break the law every day they use it. So the fact that we now have a controlled study that shows that their self-reports actually can be validated in a trial is important. And the other point to make, and another very important point, you see here 3 patients were weaned from steroid dependency. Now, like with all autoimmune diseases, one way of suppressing the immune system is to take steroids. But steroids have profoundly deleterious effects in the long term. They cause bone wasting, they cause muscle wasting, they cause ulcers. and often people die of the steroid rather than the underlying disorder. So anything that can get people off steroids is potentially hugely important for that individual.
Could I ask you to open file 9B? It's again,
Yes, I have it.
the first to seventh defendants states trial bundle. At page 1163. Go to the start of the document. Starts at page 1125 as the start of the document. It's a presentation given affiliated to the Department of Health entitled Medical Cannabis Evidence on Efficacy. And on page 1126 we see the presenters presented by Dr. Donald Abrams, MD, Adrian Few Berman, Susan Wood, Carl Kogan, and others that you can read there. And we'll come back to this document in due course, but for present purposes, at page 1163,
Yes.
it's entitled Seizures, Surveys and Case Studies. Now, when we talk about seizures here, we're not talking about seizures of cannabis, we're talking about epileptic seizures.
Epileptic fits, yes.
And it says, cannabis preparations are commonly used and recommended for seizure disorders. A survey of parents belonging to a Facebook group that focused on the use of cannabidiol-enriched cannabis for seizures in children with early onset severe forms of epilepsy found that 16 out of 19 parent respondents reported reduced seizure frequency in their children during treatment with cannabidiol-enriched cannabis. 2 reported complete seizure freedom and 8 reported 80% reduction in seizure frequency. And then a case report of a child with Dravet syndrome. What is that?
So Dravet syndrome is a very severe form of childhood epilepsy. This particular girl, Charlotte, I think was having many hundreds of seizures a week. So they were uncontrolled by conventional anti-epileptic medicine, and she was effectively bedbound by her repeated seizures, and her life expectancy would have been extremely short.
It says, case report of the child found that a high concentration CBD THC strain of cannabis, now known as Charlotte's Web, reduced seizure frequency from nearly 50 seizures per day to 2 to 3 nocturnal convulsions per month. This effect has persisted for almost 2 years, and Charlotte was weaned off of other anti-epileptic drugs. Is it because the child's name was Charlotte that the strain is now known as Charlotte's Web?
I believe so. I mean, this, my lord, this is one of the most remarkable discoveries in medicine in the last, certainly in the treatment of epilepsy, probably ever. So you have a girl who is dying of 50 seizures a day and now can go to school. But to achieve that, her parents had to break the law. In fact, I believe they took her out of state eventually to get the medicine. But this shows how, in a sense, self-medication or medication of a child by a parent can lead to amazing insights into medicine. Now we know that children with Dravet syndrome will have, or at least have a considerable possibility of responding to cannabinoids, and it's being widely used, and it is saving lives. But this would never have been studied. It is inconceivable that any pharmaceutical company would have studied cannabis in this disorder.
But I don't think you need to
Keep making that. Okay, all right.
This
Sorry.
is re-examination.
All right. Sorry.
In that same bundle, I seem to have the incorrect reference. All right, then if I could turn you back in file 2, page 263.60.
263.60.
263.60.
This is the Journal of Neuroscience, entitled Chronic Stress Impairs Adrenoceptor-Induced Endocannabinoid-Dependent Synaptic Plasticity in the Dorsal Raphe Nucleus. You'll have to translate that for us, Professor.
Right. So this is a study trying to understand the nature of depression and therefore at the level of chemicals in the brain, at the level of the receptors that the chemicals target, and it's an attempt to provide, I think, a kind of model in which it might be possible to test new drugs which could then perhaps be taken on as a treatment for depression in humans. But this is all in the rat.
Page 263.71. This is entitled Marijuana Compounds Show Promise in Treatment of Cardiac Disease.
Correct.
Explain the outcomes to us.
So this investigator has obtained a patent for cannabis-derived products as a possible treatment for heart failure. I think I explained earlier, though cannabis can have a bad effect in terms of raising blood pressure, there's the possibility that it could have some kind of protective or even enhancing effect on the heart that is suffering from heart failure due to an infarct or some other cause.
263.79. This is again from the publication by the National Academies of Health, Sciences and Engineering. On page 263.79 is the heading Sleep Disorders.
Yes.
263.80 poses the question, are cannabis or cannabinoids an effective treatment for improving sleep outcomes?
Yes.
263.81 is the conclusion. There is moderate evidence that cannabinoids, primarily nabiximols, are an effective treatment to improve short-term sleep outcomes in individuals with sleep disturbance associated with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, and multiple sclerosis. Take us through that, please.
So, this conclusion essentially says that cannabinoids, the nabiximols are it's the Sativex, the prepared combination of THC and cannabidiol. They improve short-term sleep outcomes in individuals with sleep disturbance associated with obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. These are people, usually middle-aged or elderly men, who stop breathing in their sleep. It's a massive problem. Many of them have to have respirators to ventilate them during their sleep, because if they stop breathing, then they are choking. And these are the people that stop breathing and they snore and they wake up in a very agitated state. And those repeated periods of suffocation, you may have hundreds each night, they lead to problems like high blood pressure and also to sleepiness in the day. And these people are much more likely to fall asleep when they're driving, for instance. Sleep apnea is a very difficult syndrome to treat, because normal sleeping pills, like Zolpidem, they suppress respiration. So you can't use them in people with obstructive sleep apnea. So a cannabinoid, one of the advantages of cannabinoids, we've already explained, it doesn't suppress respiration. So this is a particularly interesting innovation for people who can't generally it wouldn't be safe to take other kinds of sleeping pills. Fibromyalgia, this is a syndrome where people have a lot of pain throughout their body, typically in muscles and in the tendons between muscles and joints. It's a disabling condition, not easy to treat. Very few treatments exist, and again, it causes problems with sleep. Chronic pain, well, we know pain keeps you awake. And multiple sclerosis, the multiple sclerosis patients sleep poorly because they get spasms and that wakes them up. So this is at least promising, suggestive data that there could be utility here.
But I see there's 1 minute to go. As you know, my Lord, Professor Nutt is flying back to the United Kingdom this evening. And so, as discussed in chambers, it seems clear that the trial won't finish in this session, can't finish in this session. So we'll have to either get Professor Nutt back here or come to some other arrangement for the next session, presumably next year sometime.
Yes.
So we'll continue with the re-examination, my Lord, in due course.
Yes. I take it that there's no difficulty. This has been discussed in chambers, Mr. Bukaba, Mr. Willis. Just to
Lord,
continue with the
there's been an expansion of evidence in any event in re-examination that was never addressed in chief.
Well, I'm not
So
sure.
we're probably going to have to cross-examine. We're going to have to apply to your lordship to cross-examine. So we can't object to that, my lord. I don't know what Mr. Bukaba feels.
Yes.
So for that reason, we don't have an objection.
No objection. Thank you.
Lord, we'll be
So
starting
we'll
at
continue.
9:30 or 10 tomorrow, Lord.
Pardon?
Would we be starting at 9:30 or 10 tomorrow?
You have your previous witness.
Yes, Mr. Patterson will
Continue.
be coming back.
We can continue at 9:30. The court adjourns.
Liring ka sa Tswana. Kasi